Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is, stop fiddling, no I won't, I'll fiddle with this. Bureaucracy is one of the most important topics in organisation studies and organisation theory. Simply because in many societies where we've written organisation theory, bureaucracy has been the dominant form of organising. And so for many of you, when you think about organising or formal organisations, probably you're going to be thinking about what we class as bureaucracies. So unsurprisingly, bureaucracy, the ways bureaucracy works, the effects of bureaucracy, the need for bureaucracy, the problems with bureaucracy, has been the focus of a great deal of researchers' time and attention. So let's start off then thinking about what we're going to do in this section. We're going to spend our time thinking about three perspectives on bureaucracy, three real key insights into bureaucracy. We're going to start off thinking about Max Weber, who develops what he calls an ideal type description of bureaucracy. And Weber's argument is that bureaucracy develops alongside particular types of societies. We're then going to think about the dysfunctions of bureaucracy as described by Robert Merton. And finally, we're going to talk through the patterns of bureaucratization as modelled by Gouldner. So by the end of the session, you should be able to describe Weber's ideal type of bureaucracy, recognise some of the dysfunctions amongst bureaucrats in bureaucracies, and be able to predict the kind of patterns or interactions of the process of bureaucratizing an organisation. So those are the three things we're going to do. So before we get started, we'll first do a quick recap of what we mean by bureaucracy. So bureaucracy is, you can translate it very simply to the rule of desks or the rule of offices. And what it means is an organisation which is divided into offices. So labour is divided not to individual members but to offices. And each office, desk, has a set area of competence and responsibility. So the accountancy office is meant to have competence in doing accountancy and has responsibility for doing accountancy. The marketing office is meant to have competence and meant to know how to do marketing and therefore have responsibility. So because of these two things, competence and responsibility, each office has a span of control or an area of authority within the organisation. So the marketing department, the marketing office, having competence in marketing, has responsibility for marketing and has authority to make decisions about marketing. The accountancy office, having competence in accountancy, has responsibility for doing accountancy and has the authority to make decisions relating to accountancy. So this is the fundamental proposition, the fundamental idea behind bureaucracy, that you divide work up not to individuals but to offices. And each office has an area of competence, responsibility and authority. So then a problem comes about. Well, what happens when the offices have to work with each other? What happens when the marketing department needs some accountancy information or needs to get somebody paid? In a bureaucracy, there will be a system that prescribes or describes the relationships between the offices. Often this will then have some kind of a hierarchical pecking order, saying which office is more important, working up to the top. You might even have an office dedicated to updating rules, coordinating between other offices and making decisions when there's disagreements. But the key thing in a bureaucracy is this is formally or explicitly stated, that the area of competence and responsibility and authority in an office is formally stated, and the relationships between the offices are also formally written out. Okay. So bureaucracy is ruled by offices. Each office has an area of competence, responsibility, authority. But if we've divided labour not by individuals but by offices, the next problem that we get is, well, who's actually going to do the work? And it's here we have another key distinction in bureaucracies, and it's a distinction which it's interesting how it's playing out in contemporary organisations, but that's maybe for later on in the course. And this is the distinction between the role and the role holder. Let me check. Yeah, I am recording. Good. So, there's a distinction in bureaucracy, or the theory of bureaucracy, between the role and the role holder. So, the role is the office. So I am a marketer. And because I'm a marketer, I have the office, the position of a marketer. I have some competence that grants me responsibility for doing what I'm competent in, and I have authority. But the competence, the responsibility and the authority is the possession of the office or the role, not the role holder. So what does that mean? It means if I get a job in a bureaucracy as a marketer, that will be based on how the bureaucracy assesses my level of competence. And then when I'm in position, I will have responsibility for marketing and authority over marketing. But let's say I then move to the accountancy department and another person comes in and takes on my old role. Well, do I take the competence, the responsibility and the authority for marketing with me when I move to the accountancy department? Not in a bureaucracy, because those are possessed by the role, not the role holder or the individual person who's doing it. So when I am in possession of a role or I hold an office, I might have competence, but I'm granted responsibility and authority for doing that role. If I leave the bureaucracy, I don't take it with me. If I move within the bureaucracy, I don't take those responsibilities and those authorities with me because they're possessed by the role, not the role holder. So, it's a key distinction then. Bureaucracy is the rule of offices or desks. People only possess or occupy those offices or desks for a short period of time. When they do, they have the power and authority associated with them, but when they leave, they don't. So, typically, bureaucracies then have worked by suggesting that the official, the office holder, is only subject to the authority relations of the bureaucracy when they're in their office. So, when I'm in the marketing office and I'm responsible for marketing and I have authority to get people to help me do marketing, that works. But later on, when we go to the pub, I can no longer tell people what to do because I only have power when we're in the office. Because authority, responsibility and competence is not possessed by the role holder, but by the role holder's free to move around within a bureaucracy as they wish. They can't be forced to just do one thing. And recruitment and promotion is meant to be based on the judgment of knowledgeable superiors, based on professional competence of the individuals, not personal preference. So you're supposed to get the role because of your competence, that then gives you responsibility and then authority, not because of your personality, because of networks, or because you've been able to do internships, or your dad owns the company, or whatever it might be. Finally, typically bureaucracies have been based on the idea that because the role holder gives up their personal authority, because the role holder subscribes to the formal relations of the bureaucracy, they accept all the rules and regulations of the bureaucracy, and that might impact them in their career development and such like. They should be paid a fixed salary, given a clear, stable career path, based on their competence, their responsibility, and their authority. So that is what we mean by bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is ruled by offices. It's based on the idea that each office has an area of competence, responsibility, and authority. That there are explicit rules for how offices should work together. That there's a division between the office and the office holder, or the role and the role holder. That power, authority, responsibility goes to the office, and when you occupy the office, you have the power, the responsibility, the authority. When you leave, you no longer have it. So that's some background to bureaucracy, what we're going to talk about. In the next couple of videos, we'll start working on our learning objectives for this section. Hi everyone. So in this video we're going to talk about Max Weber and his account of bureaucracy and what Max Weber tells us about bureaucracy. So Weber was a German sociologist, very famous German sociologist, and he was one of the first and certainly one of the most influential writers to point to bureaucracy as being an important thing for us to understand. Weber tried to document how bureaucracies worked, almost as an ideal, what he called an ideal type. That means like the perfect bureaucracy. But what's most interesting was Weber's understanding of the relationship between bureaucracy and society. So for Weber, bureaucracies develop in response to trends in society. So Weber noticed that in the societies that he saw around him, particularly German society and Northern European societies, there were shifts in religious beliefs, shifts in cultural values, which made bureaucracies the most suitable. I'd like to, some people say efficient, but that's not quite right, I don't think. I think Weber more thought that there was a harmony between society and the types of organisations that society needed. There was a harmony between, or resonance between the values that were valued or privileged by particular societies and the ways of organising that matched onto those values. So Weber was very keen to focus on changes in religious beliefs, and he noticed, we don't really need to go into the theology of it, but he noticed essentially that there was a move towards Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, which brought with it a number of cultural changes. One of which was the idea that one's work on earth is in some way an expression of your position spiritually. So Weber thought that one of the consequences of Calvinism and Protestantism was that it encouraged people to see the work they did as having some wider social purpose. This led people to want to have vocations. This led people to want to treat each other with respect. This led people to start dividing up the idea of their presence on earth and their spirituality. And all of these cultural values, which Weber rolled together in the term the Protestant work ethic, which is something you've probably thought about or heard about a little bit. And the idea of the Protestant work ethic is very simply that, in Protestantism there is a particular ethic towards work which sees work as having a value, not in and of itself, but for its social value. The work and the commitment to doing one's work diligently, to doing one's work with dedication, to doing one's work well, was in some way almost a spiritual activity. And like I said, there's a whole host of theological arguments to Weber's analysis. But essentially what Weber argues is that features of the Protestant work ethic match onto, sorry, those alerts distracted me, match onto the ways that bureaucracy works. Things like the division of the role and the role holder, or the office and the office holder, map onto the idea of the division between your spiritual self and yourself on earth. So this was Weber's argument. Weber's argument was not that bureaucracy is brilliant, not that bureaucracy is the best way to organise, but that in particular societies, bureaucracy will be seen as the best way to organise and the most efficient way to organise because it reflects their cultural values. So this has led to a whole host of people then to try to analyse different societies and different forms of organising, and has led people to think about Weber's description of bureaucracy, to think about whether Weber actually got it right in the way that he described bureaucracy. Because clearly, if you're going to say the form of organising that we call bureaucracy maps onto cultural values, we better make sure A, you know what the cultural values are, and B, you know what the form of bureaucratic organising is. and this is what we're going to see as this section develops, that some subsequent authors questioned the ideas that Weber had about bureaucracy. We're not going to cover the theological analysis of the Protestant work ethic. We'll assume Weber got that bit right, but those of you that are interested might want to read into it. So there you go. I've just realised that maybe I was not on the screen for most of that. Hopefully it'll be alright. In this video we're going to talk about Robert Merton's analysis of bureaucratic personality. So Merton was an American sociologist working in what's called the structural functionalist perspective. Put very simply, that sounds complicated, but what it means is he was interested in understanding the structures of society and how they functioned, and thinking about identifying any instances where society dysfunctioned or didn't function correctly. And he applied this approach to bureaucracy, and specifically to Weber's description of bureaucracy as an ideal type. Merton's argument was that if one actually goes into a bureaucracy and observes what happens, it's actually quite different to what to what Weber says. And Merton's argument is that the reason for this difference is when people become bureaucrats, when they start to think and act like a bureaucrat, some strange, counterproductive or dysfunctional things happen. There are unintended consequences to bureaucracies. So he outlines a number of these mechanisms through which, when someone learns to be a bureaucrat, they almost learn to undermine the aims of bureaucracy as outlined by Weber. The first is categorization. Merton argues that bureaucracies primarily work by categorizing their environment and then responding to the ways things are categorized. So, a student has a complaint, it gets categorized as a student complaint, it goes to the student complaints office. A bill comes in and it's categorized as something needs paying, so it goes to the accountancy office. Merton says this move to think through categories means that bureaucracies are very resistant to change, because if the environment changes, you might need to come up with new categories. But how do you do that? How do you categorize something that's uncategorizable? Like anybody that's tried to organize their email inboxes into folders, you soon find there's emails that go in between two different things and it just becomes a complete mess. So Merton says what happens to most bureaucrats is, rather than things becoming a complete mess, they just ignore anything that doesn't fit their categorization. And of course this has the unintended consequence of meaning they become very resistant to recognizing things that have changed. It becomes very difficult for them, even if they want to think outside the box. So Merton says this way of thinking through categories, although it's meant to make bureaucracies more efficient, because once something's identified as being a certain type of thing, it can be treated very quickly, it can actually also lead to very inefficient behaviours where things get dealt with, because they fall in between two categories, or don't get dealt with, I should say, because they fall in between two categories. So that's the first dysfunction that Merton suggests happens when people become bureaucrats. The second is goal displacement. And in particular, Merton suggests that the rules and procedures that many bureaucracies implement so that they can achieve their organisational goals in an efficient and effective manner can end up becoming taken as absolutes or as ends in themselves. So the rules aren't seen as a mechanism to achieve something else, the rules are taken as the thing that matters. This is goal displacement. So instead of seeing the rules as a way of achieving the goal becomes just implementing the rules. So this, culturally is the kind of computer says no, or the it's more than my job's worth kind of idea of the bureaucrat. But Merton says this has real consequences for bureaucracies. It means that the individual bureaucrats can become almost trapped within the rules. They can become incapable of thinking outside the rules and asking questions about the validity of the rules. this is a theme picked up by later analysts who talk about bureaucracies as being a form of rational madness, where people follow bureaucratic rules and end up doing all sorts of very unethical things. We see it, well, we'll talk about that in the class, but we see it represented really vividly in lots of movies and experiments into conformity. So we have categorisation, we have goal displacement as being two ways in which bureaucracy affects individual bureaucrats and makes bureaucracies less efficient and effective. We also have depersonalisation. And these are kind of linked together, right? So Merton says bureaucrats are supposed to treat people not as individuals but as categories. And this is very important to the very ethos of bureaucracies, right? In bureaucracy, someone doesn't have power because of who they are, but because of what they are. Right? So it's not important whether you came from, the royal family or a working class council state. If you're trained as an accountant, you should get the same level of authority and respect. And this leads to many bureaucrats, Merton says, to adopt stereotyping ways of thinking, where they think, again, in terms of very broad categories, which often means they don't think about people as being individuals or even as being people. So this tendency then to dehumanise colleagues and clients means that they are very unempathetic, cold, objective, and can sometimes do, again, very unethical things to people because they're not treating them as people. They're just thinking about them as a type of thing. So again, for Merton, this can end up being incredibly counterproductive, and there's a whole host of examples from business history that we can use to illustrate this kind of thinking. Finally, Merton says, when bureaucrats step out into the rest of the world, they can sometimes think that the authority relationships in the bureaucracy are true everywhere. And this can lead some bureaucrats, he says, to adopt a sort of haughty, I'm better than you type of attitude. This is kind of, in the UK, represented in the sort of upper class civil servant who expects other people to bend the knee to them. Merton says this can happen because, again, people's participation in the bureaucracy turns them into a bureaucrat, turns them into a bureaucratic personality. They don't snap out of when they leave the office and that they take out with them into the rest of the world. Merton says this can then end up resulting in people getting sort of disrespecting bureaucrats, and actually undermines a lot of the social standing of bureaucrats. So there you go. This is Merton's analysis and contribution to thinking about bureaucracies. He focuses on the individual bureaucrat and the way that thinking like a bureaucrat can actually undermine or have unintended consequences for the functioning of bureaucracies. Hi everyone, so in this video I'm going to talk about Alvin Gouldner's contributions to bureaucracy theory. Gouldner was one of Robert Merton's students, and like Merton, he was interested in updating Max Weber's account of bureaucracy to take account of bureaucracy in the real world. Gouldner has a sort of critical analysis of Weber, which we maybe don't need to go into now, but the headline from it is his concern was that Weber didn't distinguish clearly enough between rules that are imposed on people and rules that are agreed upon. Rules which, we might say people participate in developing, and rules which people have to accept because somebody with more authority tells them to accept it. So this is sort of Gouldner's starting point, and he then goes out, unlike even Merton, and definitely unlike Weber, he goes out into an actual bureaucracy and studies it for several years, try to understand how it works. And his real question is, when, why and how does a manager turn to bureaucracy? So his interest is in the process of bureaucratization, what leads a manager to want to introduce bureaucratic ways of working. So Gouldner goes and studies a gypsum mine in the States, and he says when he got there, there's what he calls an indulgency pattern, and that's actually a good thing for me to take a quick detour into. Gouldner often uses the term pattern to mean sort of structured relationships or interactions, almost like a pattern or a kata in martial arts, or like a scripted social interaction. So Gouldner says when he got there, when he first started studying this mine, there was an indulgency pattern whereby the managers kind of let the workers do what they wanted to do, and the workers produced at the level that the management required them. So there was not really a lot of bureaucracy going on, right? There wasn't like checking up on people, there weren't lots of rules being imposed, people weren't filling in forms and paperwork. The workers, like Gouldner said, in some cases they could go when they'd finished doing the work. They didn't have to hang on just because the work day wasn't finished. People took time off, they were quite loose. But things changed. The company that owned the mine brought in a new manager, and this manager started to bureaucratise operations. And so Gouldner tries to understand, well, what happens to what led the new manager, to turn to bureaucracy. And his conclusion essentially is that the new manager didn't understand the informal organisation, right? He couldn't get people to do what he wanted them to do by having a chat with them down at the pub, because he didn't go to the pub. He didn't know all about people's personal histories and the backstories of things and the conventions and all that like tacit knowledge that the old manager had. So the only lever, the only mechanism the new manager had available to him was to use bureaucracy. But Gouldner says the more that the new manager used formal bureaucratic means, like filling in a form rather than just believing people, the more that made the workers distrust the new manager, and the more the workers distrusted the new manager, the more the new manager thought that he needed to implement bureaucracy. So Gouldner said you get this actually when organisations bureaucratise, you can get these vicious cycles occurring. So over the course of the time that he was there, Gouldner, it's been a long day for recording videos, guys. Gouldner observed this kind of bureaucratisation, and he said what was clear was that the new manager implemented rules and the workers kind of either ignored them or they filled in the paperwork but they just made it up. Like a great example of that I love, I used to be friends with the drummer from a kind of famous band who they all worked temp jobs when they weren't out on tour, and he told me about one that he got where they were put in a warehouse and there were boxes of screws and they had to count the number of screws on the boxes and write it on the box, the number of screws. So they started off getting this box out counting hundreds of screws, and then they very quickly realised no one was actually checking, so they just write any number on the boxes, right? This is what Gouldner's talking about, that you can get some bureaucratic rules that don't actually, people don't check that they're happening, no one really cares, they're just going through the motions. Then you can get bureaucratic rules which are forced onto people. So when this new manager came in, some of the things that he insisted had to happen, people had to do, and they did so begrudgingly, either because they might have thought the rules were silly, or they couldn't be bothered to fight against them, but they didn't agree with the rules. And then you have rules or bureaucratic processes which people actually appreciate. So an example Gouldner found was when he went down into the actual mine, there were rules that people enforced, and in fact he found the miners insisting that rules were upheld because it kept them safe. So Gouldner extracted from his observations that there are 3 types of bureaucracies in the real world. And actually these 3 types of bureaucracies can all occur within the same organisation at different times, even at the same time. So you have what he called mock bureaucracies, where there are rules but nobody really enforces them, people kind of ignore the rules. Then you have representative bureaucracies, where the rules are agreed upon and are mutually beneficial to both the people who enforce the rules and the people who are subject to the rules. And then you have punishment bureaucracies, or punishment-centred rules, where the rules are really ultimately about establishing the status and authority of the person who makes the rules. The rules are there because the person who makes the rules ultimately wants to show that they're in charge. And this, Gouldner says, is what happened when the new manager came in, right? He felt that he was rejected by the workforce, so he creates rules to show, I'm more powerful than you, I've got more status than you, I've got the authority in this organisation. So for Gouldner, whereas Weber talks about bureaucracy as this homogeneous thing, as if all bureaucracies are the same, actually we need to go into bureaucracies and realise that there are different types of bureaucracies: mock, representative and punishment centred.